The BBC knew it was coming, but perhaps couldn't have predicted Trump's lawsuit would land just as the government launches its review of the organisation's funding. But by last night, the writing was on the wall.
I'm suing the BBC for putting words in my mouth, literally. They put words in my mouth. They had me saying things that I never said coming out. I guess they used AI or something, and they got caught because I believe somebody at BBC said, this is so bad, it has to be reported.
A leaked internal memo written by a former BBC advisor, Michael Prescott, referenced a Panorama episode in a list of complaints about the organisation's output. In the programme, 2 sections of a speech made by Trump just before the Capitol Hill riot were edited together with this phrase,
"We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be there with you."
Directly spliced into this phrase,
"And we fight. We fight like hell."
Which had been said nearly an hour later. Trump's legal team say the Panorama episode was false and defamatory, and that even before it was aired, there was substantial evidence the BBC leadership bore President Trump ill will and wanted him to lose the 2024 election. They're suing for $5 billion for defamation and an additional $5 billion for a further count of unfair trade practices. The BBC has apologised but says there's no case to answer. The episode was not broadcast in the US and therefore to audiences in Florida, where Trump's team decided to launch the case, though Trump's lawyers claim it could have been watched, including by those using virtual private networks or VPNs. This is far from Trump's first foray into media litigation, even if it's his first international attempt. He's currently suing the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion after it published a birthday card he'd allegedly written to the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, and the New York Times for $15 billion in a case the paper said was an attempt to discourage independent reporting. He sought and lost a defamation case against CNN in 2022, but several TV networks have decided to settle more recent cases. Paramount Global deciding to shell out $16 million over the editing of a Kamala Harris interview Trump said caused him mental anguish, and ABC News paying $15 million after an anchor said Trump had been found liable for rape, when instead he'd been found civilly liable for sexual abuse.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News.
Both the Director General and Head of News of the BBC resigned in the wake of the leaked memo, so the organisation will now have to weather this latest scandal with no one at the helm. The Minister for Care, Stephen Kinnock, was asked what the government's message to Trump is regarding his case.
I think that it's now up to the lawyers to get involved in this case to decide how best to take it forward. But what I would say is that this Labour government is a steadfast supporter of our BBC. It is a vitally important institution. It's one of the greatest sources of soft power for our country. People around the world respect the BBC. It is, I think, a fundamental part of what it means to be British, to support our BBC, and we will always do that. So
the Conservative leader said the Prime Minister should get on the phone.
Keir Starmer claims that he has a good relationship with the US President, so it's time for us to see what that relationship is actually going to deliver for us. He should be talking to the US President and sorting this issue out. Otherwise, it's going to be yet another thing to add to Labour's Advent calendar of misery.
So would you be standing up to the President in the face of these threats?
Well, I'd be asking him not to do it.
As the leader of the Liberal Democrats calls for Sir Keir Starmer to stand up to what he called Trump's outrageous lawsuit, it's a delicate moment for the Prime Minister, whose relationship with the American president has been carefully choreographed to navigate trade wars as well as Russia's war in Ukraine. This is an unprecedented moment for both him and the BBC. Joining me now is Roger Mosey, the former head of television news at the BBC between 2000 and 2005. Roger, thank you for joining us. The BBC says it's not going to settle, that it'll be defending itself. Is that the right decision?
I think what the BBC should be doing now is gluing itself to its lawyers. And Donald Trump is playing politics, clearly, even though he was wronged in the first instance. And the BBC shouldn't get into a political battle. It has got to fight a legal battle, take the advice of both its UK lawyers and its American lawyers, and work out what the best way is of minimising any damage to them in this case.
And we have a question here of jurisdiction. We have a question of malice. Do you think that he has an ability to win on either count?
Well, Donald Trump is suing in Florida, and so far as we know, nobody saw this in Florida. And also, Florida was a state that he won by a mile in the presidential election. So it's quite hard to see that there was as much damage caused as Donald Trump is claiming. Also, I heard he was saying that this may have been done by AI. And although it was an edit that I don't think you or I would have made, it was still something that he said in his words in a speech. And you can argue about the overall meaning of that speech. So Donald Trump will obviously try to maximize the distress and damage he says he's suffering from. And the BBC has to be clear sighted about how much damage there actually was and how restrained and constrained, in fact, the broadcast of that material was.
But what about his argument over malice, whether there was malice in this editing?
I don't think there was. I mean, Donald Trump would clearly throw the kitchen sink at the BBC, but there's a debate going on. I mean, you can say the edit was wrong and it was wrong, but also what was the overall meaning of Donald Trump's interventions on the 6th of January? And he's saying they were entirely peaceful. A lot of commentators would dissent from that, including quite a lot of newspapers, which are now slightly egging on the Trump action against the BBC, were all saying that Trump stirred the pot on January 6th. So I think Donald Trump would find it hard to argue that the BBC was uniquely malicious in what it reported.
As someone who spent a lot of time working at the BBC, can you imagine navigating something like this without a Director General and without a head of news?
It's really difficult. That's why they need to take the best legal advice they can, fight it as a legal battle, don't be tempted to start retaliating against Trump's politics, and try to get through this in the best shape they possibly can.
The BBC has had to weather storms before. You've been there for some of them. So the Hutton inquiry, I believe also when George Whistle was forced to stand down over Jimmy Savile. How bad does this storm feel compared to some of the others that you've been there for?
This is not actually the scale of crisis of Savile, which was utterly, utterly ghastly, or the Hutton inquiry into the BBC's coverage of the Iraq War. Both of those were about huge substantive issues and about the way the BBC handled these crises. I think in the case of the Trump edit, it's a relatively small issue which had massive consequences. So what the BBC got wrong here was partly about governance, partly about the way of handling a complaint, partly about the way of handling a member of its own team who is dissenting from some of these actions. So the BBC managed to take a relatively small crisis and make it into a big one.
Several American TV firms have settled cases with Trump that legal experts say they could have had a chance of winning. Why do you think they've done that? And do you think as the BBC tries to expand in the US, it might change its mind on this?
Sometimes companies do things because they want to be in good odor with the administration. And there's been a suggestion that that's what happened with the American media companies which settled with Trump. On the other hand, you've also, if you have legal insurance, you have to take account not just of what the lawyers are saying, but what the insurers are saying. And there may come a point, if you have a choice between settling for a low number of millions of dollars as against a court case that might cost you tens of millions of dollars or more, you might have to settle in those circumstances. And that's what will be tricky for the BBC. It has to take the best legal course it can. And if the lawyers advise at some point they have to settle, in that case, it would be very awkward for the BBC to go against its legal advice. And that's where you then get into, of course, a political battle. And people say, well, you shouldn't give in any way to Trump. And the BBC's path is difficult. I don't think this is going to be easy at all.
And of course, it comes at a time when it's renegotiating the charter, potentially asking the taxpayer to give it more cash.
You're right. There is this big debate going on at the moment about the BBC and its future funding. And some of the measures suggested by Lisa Nandy today, advertising will be a very, very big departure. Subscription, equally a big departure. So the BBC has to work with the government on its future funding at the same time as having this very nasty legal case lurking there and taking the attention away from the bigger issues about how we serve the public.
Politically, do you expect the government to intervene in any way, given Starmer's relationship with Trump is so carefully choreographed?
I think it would be very unwise of the government to intervene. I think it's something that Lisa Nandy and the government will keep well away from, but the BBC will ultimately be accountable to them about how it settles this legal dispute.
Roger Mosley, thank you very much for joining us.